Hello, everyone. Glad you could join us. My name is Phillip Martin. I'm a senior investigative journalist at WGBH Radio and Television in Boston. We produce programs like Frontline, but we also focus on local. And like everyone else in the world right now, we are focused on that which is killing, at this point, over 500,000 people internationally across the world, COVID-19. And we are going to talk about this today and how journalists are covering this and should cover it. I'm talking with my colleagues in different places around the world who have been looking at the coverage and who themselves are journalists. I'm joined from Kenya by Thomas Bwire. I've known Thomas for a long time, and for the last 8 years, he's been working as a radio broadcast journalist at Pamoja FM, a community-based radio station located in Kibra slums. And in his reporting, Thomas focuses on education and empowerment of the Kibra community. He'll tell you more about himself in just a moment. And he has been focused on how this horrible situation, this pandemic, has been wreaking havoc on Kibra and throughout Kenya. I'm also talking from Brazil, from São Paulo, with Vagner de Alencar, who's co-founder and correspondent of Parasopolis since 2010. He's currently co-director of something known as Agencia Mural, this extraordinary project. Born in Bahia, São Paulo is at the heart of his writing these days, and he's focused on the favelas, the slums of surrounding São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro and other places. He's also the author of a book called Cidade do Paraíso, There is Life in the Largest Favela in São Paulo. And also welcome Vagner. And from the UK, we have Anna Lekas Miller. She's currently communications manager with the Media Diversity Institute in the UK, but she has covered all of the Middle East, or at least most of it. She's an independent journalist who covers war and conflict with a particular eye on the impact of war, conflict, and migration on women. She has worked in Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Turkey, and Iraq, filing stories for the Daily Beast, The Intercept, you name it. And she fiercely believes in freelancers advocating for other freelancers. That's also a belief I share, Anna, and welcome all of you. Let me make sure, Thomas, why don't you turn your microphone on? We're gonna unmute everyone. Okay, Anna, you, Vagner, have everyone turn. Okay, let's make sure we can hear all of you. Okay, so welcome. I'm going to just get a few, just one question from you, and then you can, and then we'll go around. This is the International Center for Journalists Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum. This is yet another webinar in the context of that forum. And today we're looking at how journalists should and are covering coronavirus, COVID-19, in quote unquote minority communities. We're going to look at that term a lot closer, first of all, because the term in itself may be problematic. So why don't we start, Thomas, with you in Kenya. What does it mean, first of all, to be a minority in Kenya and in Kibra, and what does that mean in the context of coverage of COVID-19?
Thank you so much, Philip. And this is Thomas from Nairobi, Kenya, Kibra slums. Basically, for me, I'm a journalist based in this slum, and I cover state community-based related stories. And from my understanding, what it means to be a minority is because it's like, for example, like in Kibra, it's a slum, it's an informal settlement that has many residents who live in this location. It means there are not proper infrastructure. It means you don't have access to maybe running water every day. And these are people that are always marginalized by the system of the day because they don't have all the facilities as expected of other citizens in the country.
One thing
Yes,
I'll
Philip.
do, I wanted to share a photo that you took. You've taken quite a few photos of the situation in Kibera, which is stereotypically regarded as East Africa's largest slum. And you can ask, I want to talk to you later about what that means, that stereotype, which is also happens to be a stereotype based on facts. But here's one of your Instagram photos that I think I'd like to share with folks. Can you talk about that mural for just a second, this photo?
Wow, thank you so much, Philip. Basically, this is because for the community in Kibera, the community is also trying to come up with their own solutions. Because I know there's the issue of the social distance. It's a challenge here. As much as the WHO recommends that people maintain social distance, people wear a mask. It's a challenge, especially for my community. And for me, I go around taking photos of what is happening and trying to tell stories from the community, like, this is what is happening on the ground. And when I talking about this image, it's a community mural that is along one of the walls that has a lot of traffic of people who just walk across the bridge because it's under the bridge. So a lot of people walk across the bridge to see this mural. And the idea behind this mural is just to make people understand. As much as we have these issues of maybe hand washing, wearing a mask, social distance, but yes, the committee is using these public murals to still educate people to understand and to just have these key messages go into their system that as they carry along their day, whatever they do in the community, they just remember that, hey, I need to be wearing a mask, I need to be washing my hands, I need to keep distance. Yes, Philip.
Okay, Thomas, thank you. I'm going to have you mute your mic now. We'll turn to Anna in the UK. Anna, welcome once again.
Thanks for having me.
The coverage there, everywhere, is it seems like the UK under Boris Johnson started very, very late in terms of addressing this issue. Can you talk about, I know its impact has been largely, again, on so-called minorities. Again, we'd like to investigate what that term means. But how would you describe the coverage there? And what exactly is a minority in the UK? And how has the situation in a broad sense been covered?
Sure. So I work at Media Diversity Institute, where we're looking at how media is covering minority communities. And at least in that context, we're talking about racial minorities, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, people with disabilities, young people, elderly people, and really using this as a lens with which to see their experience of a given subject, such as the coronavirus. So when this started happening, it was really clear to me and my team that this was going to be impacting working class people of color. This was going to be impacting people that couldn't necessarily stay home and work from home. And so I really started looking at how whether or not the media was even investigating this issue and interviewing people from these communities and seeing how this was playing out, which they did. It's unfair to say that the media didn't do this, but it seemed like it only happened when it was too late, that it only happened when it became people of color being twice as likely to be infected, even dying from the virus, as people who were not from minority communities. So I really think that this could have been avoided if this would have been taken into account more from the start.
Thank you very much, Anna. I appreciate that. Sometimes you have to remember that that one is muted.
We're all dealing with this new technology.
Exactly, the new technology, exactly. No, I appreciate that. The whole notion of, again, what it means to be a minority is a question I've also liked to present to ask Vagner in São Paulo. Vagner, if you can unmute your mic. What does it mean to be a minority, and how would you regard the coverage in a broad sense? And by the way, I noticed yesterday in Folha de São Paulo that they have started a campaign that's relative or seems to be related to this issue, but also to the question of Jair Bolsonaro, the president's role in sort of backtracking on this thing we call democracy?
First of all, I'd like to apologize for my bad English. I hope everyone can understand me despite my lack of fluency in the language. But Brazil is a continental country. When we talk about minorities, we are talking about indigenous, Black people. But from my perspective, I'm talking about people who live in the favelas. Brazil, there are a lot of favelas, peripheries here in Brazil. I live in São Paulo. Just in São Paulo, there are more than 12 million people living in the outskirts here. I grew up in the largest favela in São Paulo, so I know what means discrimination, segregation. So when we talk about minorities, we can talk about residents of the favelas, for example. And in this context of this scenario, political scenario with Bolsonaro, for example, we have been fighting with the president because because he have been fighting with the press, because all is fake news for Bolsonaro. So we have been facing a difficult moment here in Brazil. So the favelas always existed, but seems like everyone, and especially the mainstream media, started to look at this place, thinking about, wow, people, there's lack of water. Oh, people don't have access to internet, because the coronavirus pandemic show up all these inequalities that always exist. So my work at Agencia Mural for 10 years is to show these inequalities, to show that the favelas, the peripheries are plural, are diversity. It is something like just now people and the governors and including the press started to look at, you know.
I got to tell you, we all share a lot in common. Here in the United States, of course, the coverage of the pandemic can probably be divided in various ways. You have a straightforward coverage of cases, of both deaths and of infections. You have contact tracing data, and then there are more in-depth stories looking at the role of the leadership, the president of the country, and how he basically dictates the agenda. So you have a president who began by holding coronavirus press conferences, but at those press conferences dispensing extraordinary degrees of misinformation, disinformation, and just extraordinary degrees of falsehoods, more accurately described as lies. And this, of course, is, I'm speaking of Donald Trump. And what leaders tend to do, of course, is they create a situation where they try to make themselves look good. Reporters' jobs are to report what the leaders are saying. And then it becomes necessary to ask the question, how much of this should we take as truth? And how much of this should we take as the appearance of truth? Or in some cases, just downright, like incredulous information. So we've had that situation in the United States where people have been reporting what the words of Donald Trump, but journalists have gotten to the point where they no longer look at what he says as truth. There's at the very beginning an extraordinary degree of skepticism for someone who is constantly engaged in telling things that are untrue, particularly about poor communities. I'm wondering if you could talk about, since coronavirus COVID-19 is disproportionately affecting poor people. And many journalists, of course, come from backgrounds that are the very opposite of that quite often. How have journalists from non-poor, persons of color, or if you will, minority backgrounds, how do you think they're covering this? Or do they cover this largely through the frame of reference of its leaders? Or do you think there is something, a more deeper effort? And you can point out specific press or media groups if you like, BBC, Folio. You could talk about the press in Kenya, Radio Kibra. Thomas, why don't you start off that discussion, if you will.
Okay, thank you so much, Philip. Maybe just from my perspective is that for me personally, as a journalist based in Kibra, maybe I can just share how I've been approaching my reporting from a journalistic perspective. Basically for me, I've just been trying to, when you work to the community, you get to hear, talk to, but in a cautious way. So I also try to keep distance, have my mask on. But also when you listen to the members of the community, the issues that are coming out, like especially like Kibra has had issues like people lost jobs, for example, especially like the women who washes clothes in high-end estates. We also have these people, we call them like slum tourists. Like now we don't have any foreigners coming to visit Kibra, for example. They have lost income. They don't have any income at the moment. We have 5 cases. We have 5 cases whereby like families are struggling with food issues. So for me, like, you know, when you talk to the members of the community and also just visually walk through the community and get to see these issues, that's how I'm able to come up with my story ideas and just to push them out in the, like through a platform so that people are able to understand like, yes, from a minority community like Kibra, for example, this is how a local journalist is trying to bring out the issues. Yes, we have the pandemic, yes, but also we see this is how, from a local perspective, this is how I'm trying to approach the issues by just bringing out these unique stories to the world. And basically, like just talking to these people, and what I've also done in some cases is like just a phone call away, like calling a source and asking them to record maybe a voice message on WhatsApp, or even just a video call, or even just send some photos that they think can be used for items, so that I'm also trying to avoid going into crowded places, so that I'm also safe from COVID, contracting the COVID from my side as a journalist.
One of the things, before we go on, I just want to mention again, I sort of moved too fast on this, is in Kibra, you have what has for a long time been regarded as so-called tribal politics. In the context of that, how is this issue, just briefly, how is this issue covered? And I ask that question because we get back to this issue of minority. Vagner described it as a minority in looking at people in the favelas and indigenous people. Anna talks about, for example, there are South Asian communities and Caribbean communities. What would you describe as a minority in Kibra, and the type of coverage they receive? Again, since so much of this is informed by stereotypes.
Thank you, Philip. Basically, like how the Kibra is reported like in the world is that we are always taken as people who are living below $1 per day, which is not the case anymore, because I know there's so many energetic people like are earning like a decent living from their daily hustle. But as like even during the COVID, during these COVID times, because I remember there's a time like Kibra had reported like 49 cases of like corona, like positive cases, like around the month of May 29th. And you see the way the media was reporting about Kibra was that there was a possible lockdown that was coming. And then that brought so much fear in the community because people thought like, hey, if Kibra is locked, what does it mean for us? It means we can't move out of this location. We can't go out to hustle like the way we are used to. And this like almost came, it was reported like in the mainstream media, like almost for a whole week. And there was so much fear, like every day, like when you walk out, you guys are like, hey, Thomas, you are the journalist out there. Do you think the government is going to lock Kibra? And I'm like, okay, let's wait and see. But if we keep on our precautions, if we try to ensure that we have our community solutions, I think maybe the government might reconsider, which after, when the president addressed the nation last month, we never got that lockdown. And I'm not seeing so much reporting like in terms of like, yes, Kibra was not locked down because of the increase of numbers, but what has been happening, I've not seen a journalist coming to say, yes, this was the projection from the Ministry of Health, but as it is now, they've tried to come up with their own solutions. So that's the gap that me as Thomas from Habari Kibra and the team, we've been trying to bridge this gap by trying to ensure that we bring these local voices out there to show the world that these are the solutions that we are coming with from this community.
Okay, so Thomas, thank you very much. I'm going to remind folks again that you're tuned in to the International Center for Journalists, our global health crisis reporting forum. Today, we're focused on the coverage of of the pandemic in the context of so-called minority communities. I say so-called because this for a long time has been a term of contention in the United States. We basically toggle between the term people of color and minority, because in so many places, the minority is the majority. And the minority connotes otherhood so often that folks refer to themselves either as, again, a majority, or refer to themselves as people of color, or of course use their ethnicity or whatever their quote unquote minority status is to denote themselves. I want to talk for a second, Anna, about journalism in the UK, from the BBC to the Guardian. We know that it's overwhelmingly white. How has this impacted the issue of inequities and inequalities in South Asian, Caribbean communities, and for that matter, in some of the poorest communities where COVID-19 has had its most deleterious impact?
Yeah, I think like you were saying earlier as well, so many journalists here also are coming from these very pedigreed educational backgrounds like Oxford and Cambridge. So it's not only white, but also, very wealthy backgrounds, which just means that these lived experiences of experiencing poverty or racism is very rarely actually in UK newsroom. So then when you have a story that's affecting people of color so much, that's affecting working class people so much, it takes them that much longer to first get to the story, to have access to people to interview, to even understand it. And you notice among some of the journalists too, like sometimes, if a story that doesn't necessarily initially cross their mind comes to them, every journalist is skeptical about something that maybe they haven't encountered in their own lived experience. But when you have this lack of newsroom diversity, you have this lack of perspectives that's not saying, oh yes, that's a story that we should go cover. This is very important. We need to be speaking truth to power in this way right now. So by not having newsroom diversity, you are absolutely doing a disservice to your publication, to your audience, to the people that you're supposed to inform. And it's a big problem that needs to be improved in this country and many other places as well.
Okay, Anna, thank you. Vagner, this question. The president of Brazil, Bolsonaro, has downplayed the pandemic, even as it ravages poor communities in the favelas. What should journalists do? For example, the Folha de São Paulo or the papers out of Rio, to guarantee that these stories are being reported accurately when the information being given out by the government is misleading or worse?
So Since the beginning of the pandemic, President Jair Bolsonaro has minimized the disease. So he even called little flu. He said some people were going to die and the economic couldn't stop. So with that, millions of people following the president's words, you know, denying the disease. So this is a huge problem. For you to have an idea, Philip, he hasn't worn a mask at some events or cities he visits. And another thing is that he's having a fight with the press, as I told you before, in general, except some stations that support him. Also, in last month, the governor, the federal government has tried to hide the data of the number of the deaths, so it was a problem. So some big newspapers here in Brazil, they joined forces to put the data together themselves. And it was an incredible initiative. Folha de São Paulo and another newspapers. If on the one hand we talk about social, economic, etc. Inequalities, on the other hand we're talking about inequality of information. That's the reason we exist. The reason Mural exists, for example. And here in my job, we obviously show the numbers of what's happening. But our concern, more than that, is to show the residents of the peripheries what they need to do to take care of themselves. Because if presidents say, no, it's not a problem, it's a little flu, but more than 6,000 people are dying, we are facing a big problem. From our work here in Mural, we focus our attention to cover the pandemic, and on March we launched a podcast to try to get closer of our audience, you know. So literally with the voices of those who are feeling the problems caused by the coronavirus. And one important information I can tell you is that beyond a study by Avaz, Brazil is the #1 country to spread fake news. So fake news by WhatsApp. So now we have the WhatsApp to send these podcasts, because you know people in favelas don't have good access to internet. So we send these podcasts directly to people by using WhatsApp. So we have to trying to find ways to get closer to our audience. We get happy about mainstream media worried and join themselves to give people this information and the real numbers. So it's we have been leaving local initiatives like as Agencia Mural and this mainstream media.
I got to tell you, you answered in many ways. You answered the question that was posed by Valerie. I think this is Valerie, to all panelists, who asked, "What do you believe as to be the most effective tool to challenge the narrative by governments who are intentionally misleading marginalized communities? Additionally, how can these governments be held accountable?" at least for the first part of that question, the notion of a podcast coming through WhatsApp, that is brilliant. We have to try that here. I'm very serious. The notion of sending it directly to folks, I don't think we always utilize the audio portion of WhatsApp, and that is a good way to use that. The second part of that question, though, which I thought was very important, which was how can governments be held accountable? And one of the things I noticed, Anna, that occurred in the UK is that after the Prime Minister developed COVID-19, the narrative seemed to change. And one that was critical of the British government's response to this disease that was disproportionately impacting marginalized and poor communities, to one that was largely sympathetic toward the Prime Minister. And some of the critical aspects of that coverage seem to have disappeared once the Prime Minister himself developed COVID, to the point where even the very doctor who had warned the Prime Minister about this passed away. And there seemed to be barely any mention of his role in warning the Prime Minister. I hope that this is not too subjective a frame, but that is the impression I got. Can you talk about that? How can the British government be held accountable, for example?
Absolutely. I don't think it's too subjective a frame at all. I think you're asking all the right questions because at that moment you did see like a very kind of nationalist type of rhetoric, because you saw that the media was very much kind of preparing people for the possibility of Johnson's death, and then he recovered, but there was no question of like, oh, he recovered because of course he's the person who gets put on a ventilator before he probably needs it, because he's the Prime Minister and he's wealthy and white and has access and has all of these things that so many people don't have. And countries like the UK and the US are allegedly democracies and are, legitimately in some ways, but, this issue of holding leaders accountable is something that we need much more in our journalism in times like these, because they are spewing misinformation. They do have their own agenda, and it's you see journalists so much just absolutely repeating what they say, and often journalists are repeating not just falsehoods, but sometimes even dog whistles to, in the case of Trump in the United States. And it's really journalists' job to turn that around, be holding them accountable, and be reporting in these impacted communities and take that information and pose it to our leaders. You're muted again.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I think for sure that we too often I think there's been a lot of good journalism in the U.S. Don't get me wrong, but we also in journalism, of course, it's very broad. We have a conservative journalists represented by Breitbart, for example, and we have mainstream journalism represented by New York Times, Washington Post, and we have left wing journalism. Represented by The Nation magazine, for example, or Mother Jones. But I think everyone can agree on what should at least be considered facts. A lot of folks are problematic about what can be truth, but we should at least agree on what is facts. And we do see that a lot of those things that are known as facts totally eviscerated by the Trump administration, by the administrations in Brazil and in Kenya, and in the UK. So how do we basically agree? How do we basically get to this point of establishing, if you will, verifiable, objective, indisputable facts in reporting? I would think that data is one way, certainly, of doing that. Data is very important. Can you talk about the role of data in your reporting? Anyone, Perhaps we'll have to go back to Thomas.
Thank you, Philip. I think when it comes to data, as journalists, we need to be able to verify, counter-check, and still talk to multiple sources, because sometimes we get like sources from one source. But if you can also always go beyond just one source, maybe go talk to the relatives again on the ground, get to hear their story, and just to see are these numbers adding up? Because sometimes you get these numbers that are shared, and then once you just start to go back to investigate, just follow up on the track to see how have we been faring in terms of maybe cases reported in Kenya. Look at the graph, is it going up, is it going down? In terms of the sex, are we having so many male getting COVID-19? Is it female? Are they children? What are the age groups? And then also looking at the data, maybe from Kibera perspective, I also want to understand, like in which, because Kibera is very broad, because we have the slum bit of it, and we also have the other area that is not a slum. So looking at, these cases that are reported like every day, Kibera, 9 cases, for example, Kibera, 19 cases, Kibera, 15 cases, for example. How are these people distributed like in these regions? Is it are these people just coming from one area, like that is the slum area alone? Or are these people also coming from other like estates, like that are well off, that are of middle class people? So for me, that's how I can approach that element of data, just to understand the diverse information that I'll want to dig deeper, just beyond the figures that I'm getting from maybe relevant sources. Back to you, Philip.
Thanks, Thomas. I appreciate that. I think I should also mention here in the US that one reason why, for example, you're seeing the governors of several states here, Florida and Texas, having to turn around a rosy image of what is happening in their states. The reason they've had to turn those around is because the data doesn't lie. The cases are going up, and so therefore it is clear that the disease is ravaging a larger percentage of the population. But let me also mention, in our earlier discussions with the panelists, you may remember we talked about why we got into journalism. And I think we all agree that we got into journalism because we were having a hard time in our youth, and you're a lot younger than I am, but in our youth, basically having a hard time with how we were being portrayed. In Detroit, where I grew up, I got into I got into journalism, and it had long been part of my thinking, my future spec, if you will, what I would become. Because it was problematic to see how the place where I live was being portrayed by newspapers and television and magazines, and it bore no resemblance to what I was experiencing in my own neighborhood. And so I think when we bring this to the moment where we're covering COVID, we also, again, something Thomas said, the notion of coverage on the ground is so absolutely important. And my advice, for example, to mainstream journalists is, while coupling the data with those voices right on the ground, we can also see how the Black Lives Matter issue is seeping into this discussion, because suddenly voices that may have been marginalized yesterday are being talked to today. Individuals who were ignored 3 days ago are suddenly part of the discussion. And I just want to throw that out as well. I'm going to go to a question from a fella, Jorge Bain, that's a Brazilian name, but so it's George Bain. Is that right? In Costa Rica, I'm a Costa Rican anthropologist, got it. Living in Washington, D.C., I study the interaction between scientists, policymakers, and journalists. So I'd like to ask, what has been the role, if any, of media in pushing policies in one direction or another, locally or globally, in relation to COVID-19. Is that, who wants to take that on?
Philip, as you, I grew up in Paraisópolis. Paraisópolis is the largest favela in São Paulo, and I couldn't see myself in the media. So this work at Agencia Mural reflects our mission. What we want to our mission, that it's bringing to the center of the story the favelas, the periphery. So I think when we're talking about data, as Thomas told us, we think about the having the numbers indicate that information could be one of the weapons against the pandemic, especially as we that live in this underrepresented areas, you know. So for me specifically, and for the people who has been working with me, we have 8 correspondents that live spread in the outskirts of São Paulo, and we think our mission, what we want to report, especially now in these days, in this pandemic, is it's not the peripheries. The peripheries cannot become the easy bait, you know, for the audience of an announcing tragedy. We want to. We were talking about democracy in the beginning of our chat. Folha São Paulo has started a campaign about dictatorial things, etc.
Wearing yellow, right? They're asking everyone to wear yellow.
Yeah, yeah. So we want to share the same information to people who live in the favelas. We want to empower them to have information and fight for their rights, because if we can't see ourselves in the media, we think we don't exist. So we want to put the news on everywhere, you know.
I got to tell you, this what you just described also might, in some ways, answer part of a question someone asked here, at least on the part of some newspapers. Someone says Vagner mentioned that COVID has shed light on a lot of inequalities in Brazil, and I think this is from Taylor, and I think in other countries too, especially when compounded with widespread anti-racism protests. But how can we assure that things don't go back to normal and that systemic inequalities remain on the forefront of the media's agenda? The reason that question is so important is because reporting, like we all know reporting as journalists to be episodic. This one day it's a story, the next day it's not. But I guess what's asked here is, how do you make sure this stays on the media's agenda? And that's why I think this campaign by Folha del São Paulo is so interesting, because what seems to be happening is an understanding that the issues of Black lives, if you will, or people of color lives, and the issue of democracy and COVID-19, how this pandemic is wreaking havoc on minority communities, how they're interlocked, how they're part of the same issue in terms of what folks take away. And so they're asking the citizens of Brazil, the residents of Brazil, to wear yellow. to wear yellow in order to signify that I stand for democracy. This is something a newspaper is doing. And the reason it relates to the systemic question is because it's an integration of those issues. In the United States, we cannot talk, for example, about COVID-19 without racism. And the reason to talk about systemic racism is wreaking havoc on communities of color, on Black folk primarily, but also on brown folk, Latino, Latinx people. And it becomes important for me as a journalist, for example, an investigative journalist, to take a closer look at this issue and how it is wreaking havoc on communities of color in the United States, in the relationship to the lack of health care and supermarkets that are nowhere to be seen in those communities, and so on and so forth. Let's go back to Anna in the UK. And Anna, can you talk about the relationship between the protests that have been going on there and the coverage of COVID-19, and how those things can be better integrated, if you will? That coverage can be better integrated.
Sure, I love this question. I'm so happy that someone posed it. I mean, it's so obvious for us at Media Diversity Institute, since it is our job to be looking at systemic inequality all the time, that, you know, COVID-19 was going to be a story of structural racism from the start. And it goes back to what you were saying, where these voices that now are being platformed, maybe 3 days ago, were being pushed to the margins. And but yeah, this has been a question that I've been asking myself is, you know, there's all this momentum here right now, but how do we carry it moving forward? Because we do need to integrate this foundation of understanding structural racism and structural inequality into every story going forward, not just, you know, kind of a minority media the way Media Diversity Institute is, but something, you know, this needs to be mainstream. Like this very absolutely needs to be a mainstream way that journalists see the news and go about doing their work. So you know, at MDI, we do trainings sometimes where we go into newsrooms, we talk to media decision makers about how to make sure that they have diverse newsrooms, that they're cultivating diversity, that they're seeing the news in this way. We've helped design a master's in diversity in the media with University of Westminster that integrates academic curriculums about structural inequality and academic frameworks with traditional journalist training, like, you know, learning how to make a podcast or a radio or TV broadcast or something like that. But this absolutely needs to be something that is more knit together going forward, because it's not only the right thing to do to be accurately reporting on what's going on in our world, but it makes journalism better. It helps people know better stories, know more interesting stories, just have a better grip on what's going on and who's affected, and just better understand all of these dynamics that are going on. So it's a really crucial job for journalists right now to be saying, you know, this is an amazing moment that we're seeing. The Black Lives Matter movement has been forcing this conversation, and but how do we keep it going forward? Because that's our responsibility.
Yeah, indeed. I got to tell you this. I'm loving this panel, by the way. I want to thank all of you for participating. We're not through, but I just wanted to say that midway through. One of the questions that's very critical here is about the do's and don'ts, if you will, of reporting on communities of color and periphery communities. Those from Kibera to the favelas of Brazil to the poorest parts of London, so on and so forth, and Bristol and Liverpool, so on and so forth. And for that matter, in India and Pakistan, around the world. We have, by the way, viewers of this webinar from around the world. And many of the questions relate to the do's and don'ts of reporting on communities of color and or peripheral communities. What should we be doing as reporters if we've never reported on these communities before? You go first, and then I think I have a response as well. Who'd like to answer that question? Again, what should we be doing as reporters if we've never reported on these communities before, if it's new? Go ahead, Thomas, please.
Okay, thank you so much, Philip. So basically, maybe some of the tips I can share in terms of covering our communities. Like, for example, people need to understand about the diverse culture of our communities, because like in Kibera, we have diverse tribes, we have diverse cultures. So when somebody's coming to Kibera, they need to understand these dynamics. They need to understand the way of living, for example. They need to do lots of research, how people communicate, how people dress. Even your appearance matters a lot, because you can't expect Jones to come to Kibera. You are wearing like a suit. You are, like you're going to the office for an interview, for example, and you're coming to interview people in the locality. People will think like, maybe you are a police or investigating like a story, something. But try to understand like how can I dress, for example. And then another element that is also very important is like before you bring out the cameras to start recording, understand what is the content of this story, what is the context. Because I normally see like I normally get calls or emails like, hi Thomas, I'm doing this story and I need a source. So like you get a call like this morning and the journalist needs a source like in the afternoon. You see, this source is not even prepared. And then you start making calls. It takes some time to convince someone. So I'll advise, like before even just them coming, like prepare early, like even send an email maybe a week earlier, identify these are the sources that I want to interview the community, so that by the time you are coming, it's easier to be identified with this community or with their sources. Because sometimes I see it's not very easy for strangers to just like, you are people coming out here with cameras. It's intimidating as opposed to the eyes of the source. And they might give you not full information that you might expect. And also that what I've also seen is that some of the media gurus, like in the world, like they have the muscle, they have the financial muscles. So they'll come and even pay sources to tell the story, which I know it's not right, because ethically it's not right. So, and for me, like when I go out and interview the same sources, I'm not paying anything. But some will ask like, hi Thomas, why are you not paying me like journalist A, B, and C who paid me like some money to be interviewed? Because when you pay sources, it means they'll decide what information to give you, and you're not able to get more diverse information.
Is that payment coming from that you're talking about? Is this coming from Kenyan journalists, or is it coming from outside journalists, foreign journalists, for example? I'm curious.
This is both national journalists and also the foreign journalists.
I agree with you. The notion of paying sources is extremely problematic. It's absolutely no. So I think that's really good advice. Vagner or Anna, what your comments? Vagner, go on.
Yeah, we create a kind of guide with 10 principles, 10 tips of journalistic coverage of the peripheries, because a lot of young journalists, a lot of young students asked us, asked us how about to go to these places or to use some terms. So we create 10 principles, obviously without the temptation of presenting ready-made formulas, But here in Brazil, there's a word in Portuguese called carente. I think in English is needy. But here there's value judgment. So people are plural, so we don't have to put a word that there's value judgment. And another, it seems obvious, but it's not, because there are a lot of young journalist students from rich schools. They don't have access. They don't know what means living in a favela. And one thing we use to say is be careful with sensationalism and avoid cliches. Remember that children in the periphery and residents in general are not poor people. And another one, don't underestimate the political capacity of the residents of the periphery. People think people who live in the favelas vote in the same guy, and it's not true. So we listed 10 tips, and it is in Portuguese, but I think people can put in Google Translator and give some access to this content.
Yeah, I was hoping to put up the translated points, but it was in Portuguese, so some people understood it, not others. By the way, I just want to mention, we only have about 4 minutes left, so I'm going to want to get on it here, and all of you. There's an interesting comment here from Kunai in India. It said, "Namaste from India. I think George Floyd changed everything. Inequality that had been happening all this while, but to make this disappear once and for all, we have to look deeper into the roots of racism and discrimination." That's something we've talked about. This is another point from someone from Brazil. This is, I'm going to, forgive me, I'm going to mess your name up, something awful, but I'm going to try my best. It's Guelia Afiuni. But journalists from Brazil have been following Wagner's and Wagner's and Phillip's work for quite some time now. Happy to see you both on the same panel. It seems to me like favela residents in Brazil are turning away from traditional news organizations such as Folha Global and getting their news mainly fake, this person says, from WhatsApp instead. How can we make journalism itself more accessible and democratic for these communities? Okay, keep those in mind, and let me go down a little further. Let's ask this of Anna. I have a question. In the so-called West, much of the Black Lives Matter rhetoric is centered around shifting the burden for education about racism onto white people. In addition, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color in the West face systemic exclusion and discrimination from media institutions. Then how can we say that payment for interviews is unethical? That's the question posed. Should we see payment for interviews to communities of color in the West as a form of decolonial wealth redistribution? That is one of the most interesting questions I have ever heard. And what's your comment on that?
I think that is a really interesting question, and it's part of a bigger dynamic that we're starting to see happen with questioning some of traditional ethical rules. When we're looking at the Black Lives Matter protests, I mean, at MDI, we've run articles, should a journalist be able to attend a Black Lives Matter protest as a protester, which according to traditional ethics, maybe not, but then, how does that play if someone is a Black journalist and they want to be standing up for Black lives? So as far as paying a source and the specifics of that, I mean, my journalistic instinct is absolutely no. I think that we do, but I do think that there's other ways that journalists can maybe support the idea of reparations, of even breaking down what does that idea mean, even breaking down what are accessible ideas to be advancing. That might not necessarily be something like paying a source, because I do think that there is an ethical line in terms of paying someone and then only getting the information that they want to give you or that they think that you need, and that is something that needs to be talked about and something that does need to be considered. But I do think that there's a lot of other ways that people need to be talking about these ideas. People need to be talking about these inequalities, and people need to be talking about rectifying these inequalities. And journalists do have a very, very valuable role in that I don't think that they're taking advantage enough at this moment. You're muted again.
Yeah, actually, someone made a very interesting point here. This is Milika from, I'm not sure where Milika is from. British media do pay their sources, experts, who provide their views on certain issues. Well, the same is true here in the US. MSNBC, for example, has a roster of experts, and they do in fact pay them. WGBH has a midday talk show in New England, in which we pay people to come on board to give their point of view. So it's an interesting question and an interesting response. I guess the easiest thing to say is that it's complicated. I personally don't believe that I would pay an interviewee. The whole notion of paying sources I find problematic, but I do understand this framing that folks have responded to with this issue. It's totally understandable. By the way, we can go over a few more minutes because I think this is an intriguing discussion, to say the least. Let me take one other question, then I'm going to ask all of you to summarize. Please, go ahead, Anna.
Oh, I mean, that question from Militsa sort of inspired something else that I'd love to say this, but I mean, I do think that also that people from marginalized communities need to be treated as experts as well. Often you have this dynamic with journalists where it's like, oh, I'm going to talk to this person from a marginalized community, and then I'm going to confirm it with an expert. But why aren't the people with the lived experience experts?
Not only lived experience, I think if we talk about the do's and don'ts, I think for me personally, I don't believe, and this dictates our report, that objective reality, which has always been constructed from what has been considered those in power. We've always considered objective reality in the United States, for example, to be what you hear from the State Department. Despite all the contradictions, those, for example, that came out of 9/11, for example, and the pretenses and lies that were developed in order to rationalize a war. But yet we continue to go back to the same sources of credible information, when in fact we should be incredulous, skeptical, questioning whether or not that information is credible. So one of my do's is to look for a multiple, on a complex story, to look for multiple sources of information, to rely on data when it's applicable, to go back to my roots, and that is to say my instincts. The reason I got into this business in the first place is because I felt that people of color, minority communities, and marginalized communities were being disparaged and covered in ways that were problematic, to say the least, that did not reflect my reality within my community. So I go back to my training, my learning, my instincts, and that poor folk are going to often be treated in a very different way in terms of coverage than rich folk. And so one of my, again, do's is to look for opinions that absolutely reflect, people's lived experiences in communities, whether it be the poorest parts of Detroit or Boston or London, or whether it be, whether I'm covering caste, as I recently did in India. And at one point with Thomas in Kibra in Kenya. I was there, I forgot to mention. I've also been to some of the favelas in Brazil. I'm afraid not in São Paulo, Vagner, but in Rio de Janeiro. Let me just see if we have time for one other question. Excuse me 1 second here. Let's see. Well, there's some comments, and I guess you guys could respond to this, to the comments here. This is indeed a very interesting and important discussion. I'm grateful to you all for organizing it. Hopefully many more of these discussions panels to come. This is from Sumaya. Thank you, Sumaya. There's a nice comment here to me, and I appreciate it. Thank you very much, Tabby. To Thomas, Anna, and Vagner. One is, this seems to be a question, so I'm going to see if I can read it. I observe that media generally tend to lead with their questions based on their personal opinions and lack approach to our communities. And to be honest, most African migrant communities don't fully understand the news as it's presented here. Journalists need to be mindful of that. Thomas, what's been your experience in that regard? Oh, here, you unmute yourself, yeah.
Like for me, I'm just like, it's like when I'm going out to talk to my community members, like, because I'm also coming from the same community, at least I'm able to understand the diverse issue that affect my community. So for me, I've never had a major issue with my community when it comes to how I report about our issues of the community. Yeah, that's my thought.
Appreciate that. Folks, it looks like we are winding this down. A lot more questions, but I don't think we're going to have a lot more time. So I'd like to get each of you to take about a minute to sort of wrap this up. Again, a lot of the coverage of COVID-19, we have to be aware, is informed by both, there's some very good journalism out there, without question, but some of it is informed by stereotypes. Some of it is informed by the leaders of these countries who engage largely in misinformation, disinformation, and outright lies, like the President of the United States, Donald Trump. And so how do we do it better? What is your advice to journalists to essentially circumvent these purveyors of untruths and to get at the information that folks can use that is practical, especially for poor, marginalized communities and communities of color? Anna, let's start with you.
Sure. I mean, I think it just goes back to educating yourself. It's something that never stops throughout your life. I mean, we all have our biases, and we all, we as journalists, we all are producing work now and look back on work that we produced 5 years ago and are like, oh, I would do this and this and this now. So it's just a sign that we never stop learning, to be looking at educational resources, look at journalism that you admire, think outside the box. I mean, I think that right now we are in a situation where ideally we want to be hiring a bunch of people from a bunch of diverse backgrounds, but also COVID-19 has meant that we're slashing budgets left and right. So we need to be clever about how we go forward. But the most important thing is to be accepting structural racism and structural inequalities as facts, not as debates, and be doing our journalism with that kind of social justice in mind going forward.
Thomas, very quickly.
From my perspective, I'm thinking like even just for a journalist out there, is just as my team member says, like it's good to read widely, also do your research. And never stop learning. Like look at the social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. They're very good platforms for our story ideas, and that's where like you'll find someone will post like an issue, or it's an innovative, and you can easily pick that as a story idea, because I've done that quite often, especially through LinkedIn profiles where people share the innovations. Something that is coming up, and you're like, this can be a good story idea. So I'm thinking we can also use the power of the social media just to give us that a go start in terms of how we can report differently even during this time of COVID. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you, Thomas. Vagner?
Trying to create a podcast and send it by WhatsApp.
I love, like I said, I just love that idea. Folks, my suggestion is that we take into account what all of you had said, is expand our framework of assumption. The framework of assumption, if you will, is that which we basically we go to all the time. It's like a well. That's our reservoir of thinking about where we're going to get a certain idea. And my idea of framing comes from, again, my experience growing up in Detroit, experiencing the uprisings in Detroit as a kid, but nevertheless seeing those in the 1960s. Seeing what's happening down in the streets of Black Lives Matter and elsewhere. I go to my framework of assumption is influenced by everything from the Economist magazine to The Nation, to talking to folks on my block currently, to talking with you. Again, the framework of assumption is so important to me. It's influenced by poetry. It's influenced by books like The New Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander's book about systemic and institutionalized racism in the United States. And so it's a combination of what you've all have said. It's a question of expanding your knowledge base and figuring out ways of determining, of basically gathering facts and letting those facts basically help dictate, influence your story. So that's my approach. And so when I'm talking about COVID-19, and I just did a story about a woman who in a poor community here in Boston who died from this disease. And my approach to that story was to look at not a story about her having underlying conditions, but the story about the fact that she was in love with her garden. And her garden symbolized everything that she loved about life. In other words, I think we all want to humanize some of the most marginalized people out there, not treat them as a statistic or a simple data point, but to basically explore the lives of the most marginalized. That is my suggestion and as a passing and perhaps closing remark for this International Center for Journalists Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum. And I'd like to thank all of you, Anna in the UK, Vagner in Brazil, Thomas in Kenya, myself in the United States for this great discussion. We'd also like to thank Stella Roach for basically being the producer for this. Stella, thank you. Hello?
Hey, we can hear you now.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, now we can hear you.
How long was I muted for?
About a minute.
Oh, that's a long time. Okay.
Talking to yourself.
Okay, talking to myself. Okay, I hit something on this this device here. My apologies, folks. I just wanted to say, look, thank you very much. This has been a great discussion. International Center for Journalists Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum. And I wanted to, again, thank Anna, thank Thomas, thank Vagner, Anna in the UK, Thomas in Kenya, Vagner in Brazil for this great discussion. And I want to thank Stella for basically producing this. Thank you very much. And of course, we want to thank our audience around the world for tuning in. If you have questions, folks, you can get in touch with us on Facebook, International Center for Journalists, Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum, or through email, or however ways you communicate with the ICFJ. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.